Yeah, I mean, so what Alex said about like incremental exposure to the things that scare us is exactly what you do to get less scared of stuff. So it's fear acquisition, fear extinction, this sort of thing, and basically you expose yourself to this thing that triggers a stress response, and if you do it carefully and incrementally enough, then you don't get a stress response from that thing anymore. And that's basically what full practice does, right? And so what he's done as a soloist is that he obviously didn't start off soloing El Capitan. He started off soloing 5'9", 5'10", 5'11", and he's just put so many miles under him as a soloist. Do I think anyone can do that though? Probably not. There's such variability in terms of like our capacity to feel anxiety and fear and stress responses. Like we're all on a kind of spectrum of how like predisposed we are to feel anxiety. So people who suffer from like clinical anxiety, generalized anxiety disorder, it's called, they're going to find it harder to do this process than people who don't, for example. So yeah, it's totally right. But yeah, I just don't think everyone could solo El Cap having had the same experiences as him. One thing that you guys did talk about, though, that I would love to talk about is the difference between irrational and rational fear. Mm-hmm. And I just wrote a blog about why I do not think that that's a very useful distinction. And I don't know if you want to talk about that.
Yeah, I'd love to. Essentially, that difference between rational and irrational fear. If you're on a sport climb and the bolts are all glued in and you're only a few feet above and your systems are all totally sound, then if you're gripped and you have a fear of falling there, that's irrational. It's going to hold your climbing back. Whereas if you're on a super run out trad route with bad protection, which of course you're very familiar with, or you're soloing, then the fear is far more rational because the consequences are far higher.
It's not like it's a terrible distinction. I just think in terms of kind of fear and risk management in climbing, the better question to ask yourself when you're making decisions like this is, what's the best thing for me to do in this moment for me at the point I'm in at my climbing? So if I'll use some examples. Totally safe to do this huge rope swing off the top of El Capitan, right? Where you basically jump off the top and you fall like 100 meters free fall. Totally safe. It's been tested a bunch of times before. You can do it with 5 ropes. The bolts are totally in there. Would I tell someone with fear of falling to go and do that because it's, rationally safe? No, I would never do that. And the reason why that distinction kind of falls down is that it just takes into consideration physical harm. It doesn't take into consideration psychological harm. Mm-hmm. So someone who's like very afraid could have a very traumatic experience early in their climbing. And this happens so often where someone's like, fall, it's safe, take a whipper. And I know that like a lot of the gyms in the States, they do this lead test and they get you to jump off the last bolt. The amount of people who've come to me asking for coaching because an experience like that has traumatized them for years of their climbing. So is that less harmful than like breaking your leg because you're soloing or whatever, It's not, right? So I think that's one way it kind of falls down. Mm-hmm. And then the other way is like this idea of like, well, if there are actually consequences, it's rational to be afraid. It sort of falls down a bit as well because you might know there's loads of times where there's consequences, but the climbing's easy or something. So you probably wouldn't fall. So in that situation, is it rational to be afraid?
All right, y'all, just a quick shout out for today's sponsor, which is Physivantage Nutrition. This is their new pomegranate berry flavored collagen. Oh my gosh, it's so good. I've been a paying customer for years, y'all, because this stuff works. All right, it helps me to train harder, recover faster, and perform at my best. It's kept my fingers injury-free as I've been training hard. And don't just take my word for it. Check out their pro team. From Alex Magos to Natalia Grossman and Jonathan Segrist and Daniel Woods, so many pros are using Physivantage on the reg to level up. I think you're going to love it. Hit that link below. Use code STRUGGLE at checkout for 15% off and give it a shot. Let's get back to the show.
I also think
Right.
it like points to this idea and this misconception about psychology that if we can logically think that something's safe, we can just turn off our emotions. Right? Oh, I'm safe. Right? Stress response down to 0. Human mind does not work like that. Like the fear response system that we have in our brains is very generalized. And logic never trumps emotion, especially when it comes to anything that's remotely related to our safety. Like our fear response is designed to kick in, be really strong to get us out of that situation, and it's hyper generalized. So like just edges, cliffs, heights, the mind is like, nope, 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 not into it. So even though you can say, oh, I know this rope's not going to snap, you're still on the edge of a cliff, falling through the air and trusting this little piece of rope to get you. You can't just turn that emotion off. So I just think that like for people who've actually got to manage fear and get better at this, it's telling them, oh, it's irrational, your fear, I don't think it's that helpful.
Right. That makes so much sense. And also one can't be told that, right? One has to discover that themselves. And so is that where then in that scenario the gradual exposure therapy, kind of that desensitization of that fear over time then allows them to essentially make that discovery themselves. At some point in time, the client says then, oh, I can be safe on this sport climb because the bolts are glued in. And this, that might have been what Alex was talking about, in that sense. Essentially, once you discover what your comfort zone is, then you're able to push yourself to it. Or am I not understanding that?
Yeah, I mean, so I think there's 2 points there. One is that there's a difference between intellectual knowledge and experiential knowledge. And it's so obvious in climbing, right? Like you can look up at a route and intellectually understand that the climb is safe, because of the way the bolts are spaced or whatever. And then you get up there and you still have this stress response. And that's because you don't necessarily have the experiential knowledge that's really important to have to not have that stress response. So there's that, but there's also, so what we do when we, basically it's like to unlearn fear, is we actually so we have these experiences that trigger a stress response. So like, for example, falling on a sport route, right? Stressful. Or being above a bolt. And then what we need to do, right, is that like at the moment you have a negative association there in your mind. You associate being above a bolt with this negative stressful experience. And so what you need to do with the fall practice is you need to start creating positive associations. And that's what people do wrong with the fall practice, is they jump in the deep end and they force themselves to have these negative experiences, which can often be driven by this rational irrational distinction, right? Because they're like, well, I know it's safe to fall, so I'm just going to go for it. Rah! And then they just like so stressed, they're so tense, they fall off, they have a horrible time, and they're not cured of their fear of falling. Why? Because they're further ingraining that fear basically by having further negative experiences. So what you need to do is pare that challenge level right back and start having and collecting all these positive experiences of falling where you can be relaxed. And that's where like mindfulness and deep breathing comes in, so that you start to associate falling with this nice, pleasant, fun sensation rather than this like terrifying thing.